Good morning. We are the review of the conclusion of Ayin Beis. We're on page 1358 of Ayin Beis, volume 3, and reviewing the general flow of ideas, the general themes, informed now by what we learned in the last few months, background and source material, the Alter Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, specifically the Mittler Rebbe's long Maimer, Mika Hashem Elokeinu Makbi L'Shavis. And the last we learned was, we're talking about the Makabel. There's an Mashpia, Makabel. Classic example of the sun and the moon. In the Makabel itself, we learn in addition to the moon, there's also a luminous stone and vision or eyesight, sight. So right now, we are learning about this Makabel, which, as I explained in the previous class, is why it's such a vital point, because it's all about the transformation of this world, the interface of connecting existence with God, with godliness, with the divine. That's essentially taking the Makabel, the creation, which is initially begins as a recipient, that lesla megamah klum, like Malchus, has nothing of its own, and filling it up with thelikus. We called here Zah Malchus, that Malchus, and to the point that Malchus actually is rooted even higher because of its Helam, the Nekudah of Malchus. It's rooted in the Helam Ha'atzmi, what he called the Nekudah Ha'atzmus, which has a combination of both. On one hand, being no Gilui, but it's higher than Gilui, so therefore it also includes Merchav Ha'atzmi, total expansiveness. However, today it's not revealed. And that's the Avodah that we do, and the work that we do, that Malchus is filled up to the point that it will experience it l'asad loving. That's the last thing we learned on page 1358. The idea of the merchav. So mina meitza karosi ka, anani ba merchav ka. So like he said, that in yisha merchav b'chinas Malchus dafka, because it has that capacity, because it's rooted all the way in Atzmus that's higher than any form of revelation. And that's where you get to through tshuva, shemetech primis nekudas halev, what he called azaz atzmus, tzaikas halev. That type of tshuva, that is what draws down the expansiveness from the highest levels of the etzem. Dafke minach meitzer karasi. And then he said, Omnam, lebchinas merchav ha'atzmi yeshlemer, shezo shegam agbolas hakeli yeh b'chinas ein sof. So it's not just about reaching a place that's beyond parameters, but that also the structure. That's why we find Torah, which is Tam v'Seichel. Torah has structure. At the same time, the Torah is also, and has therefore, it's also expansive, Ein Sof. Like we talk about the Mokem ha'Adon Ein min Amida. The space of the Adon is both space and beyond space. Nimsach b'chinas atzmus l'mayla mikedi gilui mishon davke b'chinas hamerchav b'chinas ein sof mamish. And the same thing with Malchus b'chinas nekudah be'etzem b'chinas helam b'chinas l'shosha b'chinas atzmus ein sof. And la'osid yizgala. In the future, it will be revealed. Yeah. Now, in the context of everything we're learning, keep in mind it's not just enough to have Malchus and etzem. We need gilui, revelation. And that's why Zohar plays a critical role. So even though at the end, the eye itself will see godliness, but for the eye to be able to see godliness, today it needs an external light. He hasn't discussed the eye yet. I'm just mentioning it in the same for the context of it. So bottom line is, it's still a Makabel, meaning it needs the Mashpia to draw out from it its power. That's the key here. So it's true that in Malchus, Seif Ma'aseh Machshava Tchila, the etzem lies embedded within Malchus, the Nekudah of Malchus, but now you need the work to make Malchus, to binyan Malchus, to build it and expand it and so on, like we said. And La'asad Lavi, it will be the combination. You'll have the qualities of all, both the Etzem and the Gili. That's where we stopped at the end of the paragraph at the bottom of page 1358. So let's continue the summary. And keep in mind that though a lot of this is being grounded in Kabbalistic sources in what Malchus is, but overall the bottom line is the interface between existence and the divine. And Malchus is now representative of how existence comes into being, because like we learned, from Zoh itself, you can't create existence. It has to go through the Makabel, through Malchus, into Biyah, but then comes the transformation that we've been discussing. Now, he continues in this dissecting the anatomy of Malchus, which is so vital here because it's the Makabel is ultimately is Malchus. Less lo megama klum. He's going to now add a new point, an additional component in understanding Malchus. Somebody want to ask something before I continue? Okay. So at the bottom of the page, the new paragraph, 1358, and if you want to follow the text, if you want to follow along and you don't have the book, it's you can find it at ayinbeis.com. He says like this now. Hinezez vadai. Now this is certain. Nekudah of Malchus, yesh ba'er. So even though we said it doesn't have anything of its own, but you have to say that it has Eir in it, because even though it was Netzel, like we said in the Nekudah, remember the Shadish, Netzel b'chinas Shadish in a Nekudah, say Shadish, tak Nekudah Achas, that Nekudah you have to say has an Eir and a Keli. Because all the spheres, Kamoi, Kol HaSpheres, Netzalu b'chinas Eiris, so though there's a distinction how they emanated, if you remember Zoh, the Seit Shadish emanated as 6 facets, Vav Ktsavas. And Malchus only a Nekudah, only like one cell, one spark, one seed. But everything in the spheres has Eris and Caleb. Just a question of how it manifests. So the Rebbe Rashab is going to now further discuss that Malchus, until now you could say Malchus is just a Keli, and the air comes from outside, meaning from Zoh, from the Mashpia. The moon is just a container, and its light comes from the sun. But if you recall, he talked also about the moon as being a moir, that the moon has light, it just doesn't have a shining light. But I can't say it doesn't have energy. And remember, light, let's not confuse, light does not always mean brightness. Light means energy, and there's different types of energy. We learned earlier that the sun and the moon is Koyach HaGili and Koyach HaHelim. Koyach HaHelim is also divine energy, the power to conceal, as we learned earlier. Just keep this in mind as we continue here. So Malchus also has an Eir and Keli. Rak she'eru l'tzerech atzmo levad, v'lo la'ashpia. The Eir, however, in Malchus is only for its own needs, meaning only to identify itself, the fact that there is a Malchus. So even when we say Malchus doesn't have anything of its own, doesn't mean there is no Malchus. There is a sphere called Malchus. So he's now saying the Eir is only for itself, not to be mashpia, not to transmit to another. Now, most likely, this is similar to saying the student, even before the teacher begins to teach him, he has seichel. However, the seichel is for himself. He doesn't have yet seichel to be mashpia to someone else. Then the teacher begins to teach him, so he has an idea that he then receives and integrates, and then can teach that idea. So, but on its own, it's only the Shedach Chatzma. B'hainu, the Yeseh b'chinas Nekudah, being that Malchus is only a Nekudah, only a point. Memele Kabbalasa ha'er, hu b'chinas Tzimtzum l'tzarcha levad. Since in the state of Nekudah, therefore its receiving of the Eir that it receives is in the state of Tzimtzum, only for its l'tzarcha levad, a limited amount just for its own survival, so to speak, for its own sustenance. Okay. And that's why Memela Malchus is not yet in a state where it could be ispashtus lahashpia, in a state of expansion or extension to transmit to another. And he's going to explain this now further. Now, he's going to refer to, if you remember earlier, he referred to Malchus Shcheda Niva Nova. It's dark, but beautiful. Okay. Pasha Bolak, Al Maimer Hazoyar, Al Posuk Shcheda. So he's now quoting from a beauty Azer from the Mittler Rebbe, most likely. And Pasha Bolak. I'm just looking before he brought a Zehar. It's a different Zehar. Okay. On the pasuk Shchedani, I am dark. Al derech moshel tinuk, hatinuk. An example for this would be a child, a young child, a baby. That's nursing only for its own needs. So a child, especially a young baby child, a young infant, an infant is not really mashpia to anyone. An infant is a completely state of makabel, so it's receiving, it's nursing. It's incapable of transmitting vitality and sustenance to others. An infant, it can't feed another person. An infant needs to be fed. And a godel and an adult who is mashpia vitality and mozin and sustenance to others, this is the example he's giving, because he has more. If a person, for instance, would only have enough just to sustain themselves, they wouldn't have anything to give to another. So an agolik is able to give because he has ribui mozin yesem mikfit sarchilas, more than he needs for himself. I remember we discussed it when we learned it the first time. Most likely what he means is that, you see, for example, you take a plate of food, an adult that is, the plate of food, there's enough food for him and for others, so you can take from the food and give to others. But the amount that you nurse a child with is exactly what the child needs. There's no extra. It's not like the child gets a plate of food and there's extra for others. It's completely minimal, only for what the child needs, because the child doesn't have the kalim for anything more than that. That's the example that he's giving for this. Ukamoy came b'seichel. And the same thing we say by seichel. Here the example was food. Same thing with intelligence. The kashem meven ha-seichel v'hasvara b'tzimtzum, that when a student understands an idea in a very limited way, b'tzimtzum, rak kafi hasoga chitzenis, only according to his outer understanding. In other words, the student is getting just enough for him to understand it. In that state, when he's like a nekudah, receiving, he's only getting that amount, limited amount for him to understand, and he's unable to take the idea and put it and manifest it in other words, in other combinations and explanations to explain it to another. So, for example, you teach a young child Aleph or A, B, C. So an Aleph is just a very limited, it's describing to the child, here's how you make an Aleph. Here's how you shape it. There's really no explanation. You're just giving over a very limited piece of knowledge to the child. The more the student is receiving more ideas, the more understandable it is to the student, the more the student can then go ahead and re-explain it to someone else. Again, I didn't look inside the Biyuda Azer, but that's likely what he's saying here. It's only when you know, you comprehend, you understand the idea in its depth and its inner meaning. Increasingly, become then you can carry it over and pass it on with a number of letters and combinations of letters and in different explanations. But when you get a bit symptom, like in the context, like the child that's being nursed, just a minimum, there isn't enough to really go over to be able to, just enough what you need to know. Not enough for you to be able to develop it, to explain it to others. Now, the reason most likely that the Rebbe Rashab is elaborating on all of this, I go back to the key point, because he wants to explain how the Makabel works. What is the process of us growing? So what he's saying here is essentially we don't come from with zero. Malchus is not zero. Malchus are Eir and Keli, but it's in its most diminished state. It's in a Nekudah state. And then it through Aveda and Ashpa, it grows. Well, remember, there's two ways. Let's Gamal Klum means both Malchus receives from above it and receives from below from the Aveda. But right now he's talking in general. So Malchus is explaining the dynamics, how this process works. Let me stop if anybody wants to clarify anything. Any questions so far, what we just learned? Okay. Fine. Maskil el dol, the begins ashpa say yesod shebesechel, begins maskil mokra sechel dafka. Okay. In other words, maskil, the word difference in sechel and maskil. Maskil is the source of sechel. That's already when you have ashpa say yesod. The yesod is already the sphere before Malchus that allows the expanding of the idea. That's all he's adding here. So that's one point regarding Malchus that he made. Furthermore, the spark or the point of Malchus, being that it's a Nekudah Hashroshis, like a root, just a root point. And that's how it emanated from the infinite divine emanator. So another point in what we said earlier, what makes Malchus unique, as opposed to Zah. Remember, Zah emanates as a mashpia. It's given immediately 6 facets, chesed, gvura, tiferes, netzach, yesod, like the sun, that automatically gives off light. That's its role, its function. Malchus, on the other hand, is only a Nekudah. So he's now saying another quality that Nekudah has, that it completely has nothing of its own, because it's completely attached to receiving from its source. The Kabbas Ereshem Amaitz Lelian. But I did the Torah Lemivla, like, excuse me. When you're busy absorbing, you cannot exude. Mivla from the word blia, like to swallow. When you're absorbing something, polit means to exude, to give off. It's a classic statement regarding the laws of kashrus about different foods that either exude or absorb. I use it very often when we talk about chazara. That when you're busy absorbing, you can't be busy exuding. You're busy listening, you can't be speaking. So since Malchus, he says, being a Nekudah Hashroshis, so it's in a state of complete receptivity. And therefore, loipolit. So this is an oidzos. In other words, in addition to what he said before, being a Nekudah, only the chayes it receives is only for its own need, and therefore it doesn't even have what to give to another. He's going deeper now. Not only doesn't have anything to give to another, it's not in a state of ashpa. It's in a state of Kabbalah. When something is in a state of absorbing, it's not in a state of giving. In other words, even if Malchus has something, it wouldn't have anything, it wouldn't give, because it's not in that state. Now, obviously, Malchus doesn't have, So there's 2 points here that he's making. One is that Malchus and Nekudah, simply it has only the amount that it needs to sustain it, like the infant. And two, it's an estate, a state of being. It's mood, so to speak. It's is one of absorption, not of hashpah, of giving off. The yadua, the kamoy kenu b'chol asfiras datzilis. Okay, so he's qualifying this now with a parentheses, which at first I thought I'd skip, but now I'm thinking I should read. It's a long parentheses. It goes almost down a good 20 lines at least. It goes down. So I'm going to definitely read parts of the parentheses. It goes down, let's see here, all the way to the line that begins the terida lemivla. I did the terida. I did the tarida. Okay. So he's going to explain this further in comparing Malchus to other spheres. It's known that the same thing as all the spheres of Atzilus are in a state of this. So seemingly asking a question. The other spheres are also makabel from Elikus. So it's true they have an identity, chesed, gvura, teferes. They're not solely in a state. He's going to explain this now. But they also are in a state of bittul, basically. We know the spheres of Atzilus, they don't have an independent agenda. They are in a state of drawing down and expressing divine faculties, divine attributes. So we get all the spheres, the aspect of absorbing is only the top 3 spheres in each sphere. In other words, the Chachma Bina Das or the Kesser Chachma Bina within Chesed. That's in a state of absorbing. But the 7 lower spheres, meaning from the Chesed all the way down, those are in a state of Hashpah. So it's true, all the spheres have a bittul to that which is above them, but they also have an element of Hashpah, of transmission. That's how he's qualifying the difference. Whereas Malchus only doesn't have, remember, it's only a Nekudah. It doesn't have the other facets. So all it is a state of Kabbalah. Yeshlemer, the Kamei came b'china Zah b'chlal. You could say the same thing, you can say, is Zah in general. Zah is the 6 middes, the 6 emotions. Ima yesha nesarak b'china Vav Ksavis. Even though it emanated only 6 facets, like we learned, so remember earlier we learned that it emanated as 6 facets. And Moichin was Teisvis, was an additional addendum. Nevertheless, he says it still has Moichin. It's just a lower level of Moichin. A Moichin called Moichin Diyanika, if you remember, we learned Ibra Yanika Moichin. So there's a state of Moichin that's still in a very narrow flow, but it has Moichin in it. You can't say Midas don't have any Moichin at all. Based on that, that Troda, Lemivla, that its occupation when it's busy absorbing, so that's where you find, that's where the dvekus, that connection to absorbing that which is higher is in the 3 top spheres in Zoh. But the Vav Ksovas themselves, the 6 facets, which is the lower spheres within that, is in a state of transmission. Now the next section, I think I'm going to skip because it's going to get a little complicated. Yeah. Going to get into more details of the spheres here. I'm just going to the end of the parentheses. This is all about Zoh, the higher spheres. Al b'chinas Nekudah of Malchus, I did the trida lemivla loy polit klal. It does not have this distinction that it has part of it absorbing and part of mashpia. It's completely absorbed in receiving and absorbing, and therefore it's not mashpia at all. Loy polit klal, it doesn't exude at all. So he just wanted to make that distinction, which again is helpful because again, in the process of our own growth, remember we begin like an infant. We begin in a state of complete makabel. That doesn't, not mashpia at all. Especially if you think in terms of the moment of conception, you have only one cell. And definitely throughout pregnancy, it's only as we grow that we begin to also have enough to give off to others. So we all begin in this state of so-called vulnerability, if you wish, and lack of anything. And everything we receive is from above us. And that's what Malchus is. Okay. Let me stop again if anybody wants to clarify anything or ask anything. No. Okay. So I'm now the line that begins, the end of the parentheses, the trida lemivla. And on the contrary, hatirda lemivla, the Nekudah of Malchus, this effort, this process of it absorbing of Malchus, the Nekudah, the point of Malchus, who b'chinas Aliya and Hiskalilus. One second, please. It's in the state of Aliya and Hiskalilus. So that simply means in order to receive, you have to be receptive. You have to be in a state of elevation and encompassing something above you. When you're doing something you're actively doing something like transmitting, you're not in Aliya and Hiskalilus, you're in Yerida v'hamshocha, in the language of Chassidus. So he's saying, Adrabah, Malchus in the state of Aliya and Hiskalilus. Shezeu gamke masha omar al zeh b'zoyar shu in yishcherani. This is also the meaning what the Zohar says, why it says, I am dark. Because it's a b'chinas shachris. Malchus is in a darkened state. Why is it in a darkened state? Because in a state of receiving, of elevating. It's not in a state of shining light, but in a state of histalkus lamayla. Histalkus meaning it's expiring and elevating upwards to receive from that which is above it. So if you think of it in the context, let's say the silence of a student, they're not in a state of hashpah, they're in a state of an hamshacha, they're in a state of transmission, they're in a state of Aliya and Hiskalilus. And that's what we mean when we say, Kabbalistically speaking, like he said, that the Nekudah of Malchus is Keser within Malchus. That's the level of Ratzon. And will is not, when you say Chachma or Bina, or you say Chesed and Gvura, they have a function, a role. The Ratzon, all it is God's will. Just like I've given the example of the difference between the ministers that the king sends out to deal with the people, to counsel them, or to collect taxes, or to fight wars, or to work in the fields. But then there's the ministers that are his own internal ministers that are in the interior, that are always with him. All their job is to express his will. So that's a state not of Ashpa, that's a state of internal state. That's the Keser Sheba Malchus. The Ratzon b'chinas histalkus hiskalilus litbig b'maitzel tamid. To connect to the Ratzon, its job is not a particular function. It's just expressing the will of the maitzel, of the emanator, always. The Ratzon aloshem merutza v'hu haritza oy b'chinas hamshacha oy b'chinas halah. Loshem merutza. Merutza can mean that he is content or merutza can mean in the state of running. Haritza oy b'chinas hamshacha. So Ratzon could manifest hamshacha if that's what he wants. Oy b'chinas halah, or in a state of Allah. Here, I think what he's saying here is that even the hamshacha, in the state of Ratzon, it's really just, all it is God's will. My imratz lipcha. When your heart will race, when your heart will run. So I'm not sure whether this parentheses saying that Ritza would seem to sound like a hamshacha, but he's saying here the Ratzon lo shemerutza Ritza b'chinas hamshacha b'chinas Allah. I stand by what I'm saying. It has to be. It means here that Ratzon can manifest in different ways. Depends what the king wants. But from the point of view of Ratzon, Ratzon is simply just expressing the king's will, or the master's will, in this case, the Maitzil, the emanator's will. Kesa. And this is why Malchus is also on Nekudah, just a point. A point has like no extension, no expression, no expansion. Because it doesn't have any spastus, expansion, it doesn't spread out, doesn't expand in any way, v'amshach and transmit. That's why, on the contrary, it's the exact opposite. It's in the state of being absorbed, being encompassed within the above. Like the example of a flame, if the flame would not have a wick, what would happen? Without a wick that would contain it below, the flame would just expire and disappear. So it's the wick that grounds it. So in a sense, what is the flame? The flame essentially is looking to seek to be absorbed in its source. Same with the point of Malchus, since it doesn't have kalim. Now again, he said before it has keli, but the keli is completely either minimal or only there for its own need, or like he's saying here further, it's only there to absorb. So it doesn't have kelim nechas behem lamata to contain it below. Al kein b'chinas Aliya Hiskalilus. So on its own, the Nekudah of Malchus is in a state of Aliya and Hiskalilus. So here's another distinction. Zah is in a state of Ashpa. The sun is not looking upward. The sun is constantly in a state of emanating light. It's shining light to the earth, and for that matter, to the whole solar system. The sun is shining. Malchus, like the moon, is in a state of Aliyah to reach upward, and not in a state of shining, but a state of receiving. Any questions? I keep stopping by each topic just to make sure everything is clear. Okay.
I have a question. A couple things. First, when it's at a level of b'chinas Aliya Hiskalilus, it seems like it's yearning. It's reaching up for a hashpa from above to have Elikus channel into it. So it's not just sitting there waiting. And then the idea of it not being a mashpia itself, I mean, or let's say saying it doesn't have a keli. I mean, it has a nekudah of or in its shoresh. It has just a point of light, but it doesn't have keli. It seems like it's nothing but a keli. We talked about it just having nothing of its own. It's just there to receive. So I didn't understand some of those two concepts. I mean, I get that it's yearning for to absorb. That I get. That's the Aliyah. But I don't understand how it can't be a keli. It has to absorb something. Furthermore, it has to be mashpia into biyah. So it has to take in. I mean, I guess it could be derech ma'avir. It could go pass through it. Maybe that's the answer. But it's a conduit. So it has to absorb something. So it has to be a keli.
So it is a keli. That's why he said, the bottom of the last page, he said, Netzala keli. But he explained, but it's only a keli in order for the absorption part, not to transmit. So let's separate two questions here. One is, what does it mean when we say Malchus is a Keli? And secondly, what about its Ashpa to Biyah? Let's separate the two questions.
Okay.
The first answer is that Malchus is only like a Keli. And even the that it has is only for its own need, or like he said, it's in a complete state of absorption. So think of like the student that is just absorbing what the teacher is saying. That's it. That's its role. So that's what means Aliya and Hiskalilus. It's not about transmitting. The sun or the mashpia is in a state of amshacha. Yirida of amshacha. It's extending itself. It's expanding. It's shining light. Malchus, it's on its own. Its role is just to absorb that which comes from above it. That's number one. So that's what he means here when he says that doesn't have necha. He said doesn't say no, there's no kelim. he says ein lo chins lias nechas mehem lamata. Doesn't have containers to contain it like a psila. It doesn't have a wick to contain it to be able to be contained below. So therefore, it's constantly in a state of being encompassed like the flame in its source. That's my understanding of what he says here. As far as the second question you're asking, we're going to get to that. We'll soon discuss that. That's already Malchus in a separate, not as it is on its own, where Malchus is being directed now that you've received and absorbed from above, which is your natural state. Remember, this is how Malchus is netzal b'seit shedish. We're not talking about Malchus afterwards. Afterwards, Malchus' role will be, yes, exactly that, to be mashpia and to biyah. But he's not there yet. Right now, he's talking about Malchus on its own, the way Malchus is formed and shaped as a makabel. Then he's going to talk about Malchus becoming a mashpia, which the truth is, I think he said it also earlier. If you go back, I think on, let's see here, the previous few pages back, he said that there's Malchus as it is in a state of makabel, and then I'm just looking where it is. Hold on, 1 second. Yeah, on top of page 1357, he spoke about that. Then there's another stage where Malchus becomes a mashpia. But right now, what he wants to do is analyzing Malchus on its pure own as it emanates. Like remember what he brought from Movei Sha'arim, the difference between how Zah emanates six facets as a mashpia, like the sun, and Malchus like the moon. So on its own, it's not a mashpia, it's a makabel. Then there's going to be another aspect of Malchus as mashpia. We'll get to that soon. Okay?
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so now he says like this, at the bottom of page 1359, he says, V'zeu gamkin sheyesh hefresh ben Zoh Malchus. This also explains another difference between Zoh and Malchus. Well, I don't know about another difference. A difference between Zoh and Malchus. The Zoh, ima yeshu gamkin b'chinas dveikus ha'ol bilosei. Since Zoh is also, like he said before, is also in a state of bittul, that's attaching itself. The olol, the effect is connecting, is cleaving to ilose, to its cause. Ubchinas aliyah, and a state of aliyah. Umekol mokim rather. Nevertheless, liyesei b'chinas vov ktsovis hariu nechaz bazayin tachtenis. So even while it's doing that, it's still contained and holding on to the zayin tachtenis. Like you said before, the gimel reshenish is the way it's reaching upward. So even a Talmud that's teaching, he's still connected to his teacher because he's teaching what he received from his teacher, but he's in a state of also teaching. Nevertheless, though, in other words, he has that element of dveikus and connection to his source, nevertheless, he's also transmitting, and also from the Gimel Rishenis, which he's received, he's also transmitting. Avaham Malchus on the other hand, rak liyeshe rak nekudah achas, being that Malchus is just a point and doesn't have any identity of its own. Levad, top of the next page, 1360. Going back to his original point, it's a nekudah hashrashis, just like a point, root point that emanated from the Maitzel without any facets and any personality. Ein lo dover hanechas. It does not have something to hold on to. Aliya and Hiskalilus. So it has nothing, basically, it has no like gravitational pull, some type of grounding element that draws it down. So it's in a state of Aliya and Hiskalilus on its own. Yeshlemer. The Rebbe Rashab continues analyzing this, says, and you can say, the Mishum Zeh yesh hefresh gam be'etzem ha'aliyah. So this also comes, that because of this, there's also a difference in the very Aliyah. So besides the fact that Zah, though it's an Aliyah, it is also in a state of Yerida, it's also in a state of manifestation, where Malchus is only in a state of Aliyah. But there's also a difference in the very Aliyah itself, in the very personality, Etzem, the very Mahus, the very essence of the Aliyah. Who? And what is the difference? The Bizah, Mashateva al Lidovik Bezah. When you say the nature of the effect is to connect to its cause, that is that it's being drawn to its source. The and its primary desire in this aliyah by Zah, is to receive from its source. But b'malchus is different. And b'malchus it's not to receive from its source, it's to be encompassed in its source. So that means in Zah, there's some type of like benefit it's getting, the benefit of receiving. In Malchus, it's what the bittul is a deeper one, since it has no identity of its own, it's just being encompassed, and it wants to live there, so to speak. That's where it wants to reside.
Can I ask a quick question?
One second, let me just finish the point. One second. V'zeu the ikar inyan harotzei hu b'chinas Malchus. That's why we say the primary rotzei, yearning and longing, is in Malchus. Why is Eretz called Eretz? So this Medrash says, Eretz is called land. Eretz is the level of Malchus because it's yearning to fulfill the desire of its master. That the lower Nehura, the lower river or the lower waters of the lower light is always calling and yearning to join the higher one. To end the parentheses, elsewhere it's explained, so now it seems to be coming because of its quality, that it's so bottle that it wants to be in its source. That's where it wants to live. It wants to be encompassed within its source. Elsewhere it says it's due to its distance and its lack. That's why it wants to go there, because it's feeling a lack. So different explanations of what is driving Malchus to go there. But what he's saying here is that Zah is to benefit from it, is to actually receive. It's like the student who wants to receive from his teacher. Whereas in Malchus, it's to be encompassed within it because it doesn't have anything of its own. It doesn't have its own identity. So it wants to be elevated into its source and stay there until, obviously, Malchus is told that it has to be mashpia to biyah, which, as I said, we will learn about. Okay, that's the parentheses. You go ahead. You want to ask something?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a Chassidus applied question. Obviously, if you don't like it, you can take it offline, or just say there's nothing to say about it. Okay, so the preface is that it's maybe a stupid question, but it seems to be saying that Zah, in its nature, is intrinsically a pass through. It does have an aliyah. It does seek from above, but it necessarily also has the tachtonis, has the gimel shonos that are taking from above, has the gimel tachtonis that are essentially there to yield down below it. So it's like a pass-through, an automatic pass-through. It's Shoresh is pass-through. Malchus has it too, but in a different way we're going to talk about.
Did you say pass through? I didn't hear the word
pass through. Yeah, it's passing.
What?
It's Elikus is channeling through it. It's seeking from above. It's in a state of Aliya to take from above, and it's Mamela automatically transmitting below. That's what he seems to have said here. That it's just taking.
He doesn't use the word pass through. He doesn't use that expression at all.
No, he doesn't.
I'm not sure why you're adding that, but okay.
Well, I guess I'm trying to speak succinctly, but I thought I understood him to be saying that it's not just absorbing. It's also passing down, passing.
I would say it's being mashpia. It's transmitting. That's the word I would.
Yes, exactly. Right, but it's also taking from above. So therefore, it is a pass through. It doesn't have.
Is it relevant to our discussion whether it's a pass through or? I mean, I wouldn't use the word pass through. It's a very different word, and it means something else. That's not really. But bottom line is okay. It's makabel and mashpia. That's what he's saying.
Okay, that's the point, right? Okay, so here's a consensus apply, and I understand that pass through may be direct ma'avir. It doesn't go through it all. So sorry, I used that word. But okay, so it's a makabel and a mashpia. So the Chassidus applied question is, when someone emotes, when a human being emotes, right? Is it fair to say that there's something about even let's say anger, what we might classify as not a nice emotion, that there's something godly about that inability to hold it and letting it go, as ugly as it may be. There's something godly about the human's transmission of emotion, that it absorbs within whatever the heart or the mind, and then it just releases it. I don't know. I'm wondering if that's a manifestation of God's personality, if you will, that maybe God's in control of himself, as we believe, but the human isn't. So the human just raw emotion and just lets it go. But nevertheless, it's built that way. Our minds and our hearts are built that way, that emotion should both come from somewhere, maybe from our own mind, and then flow out. It's like no check and balance. And therefore, the emotions that come out, even if they're not nice, there's something godly about it. Can you say that? Or you say, no, it's all tainted by the Nefesh Bahamas and by the Yetzer Hara, and you can't say what I said.
I wouldn't say what you said, no. I would phrase it this way, if I may. In the context of what you're asking, our emotions, as he says in Tanya, the 10 spheres of Atzilus as the root from which evolves our 10 faculties, right? The 3 intellectual ones and 7 emotional ones.
Right.
Yes. So the divine soul has 7 emotions: Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Yesod, Malchus. Chesed being Ava, love, and Gvura, Zira. So when we follow, like it says, Mahu Rachum, Afata Rachum. Just as God is compassionate, you should be compassionate. Mahu Chanun, Afata Chanun. Just as He is kind, you should be kind, etc. So then our emotional attributes are aligning themselves and expressing the divine attribute of Chesed or Gvura, Yavas Hashem, Yiras Hashem. But we also can have emotions that are, like you said, emotions of the animal soul, like let's say anger, or Chesed to the wrong things. You have love of some taiva.
Like
it could even be something that's prohibited. So then, as he explains in Tanya, is Zelu Umazeh, those are the 7 emotions that God created that correspond to the 7 holy emotions.
Okay.
So it's correct that it's your emotions, but I would not call them as divine expressions. I would call them as the alter ego of the divine expressions. Let's put it that way.
Thank you. Yeah, I should have understood that. I'm forgetting Tanya there.
No, it's fine. It's now obviously the very fact that we have emotions, ultimately, because you could transform an ava, like we learned in the whole Torah that Mitler Rebbe's Maimon. We can transform the ava of the world, the materialism of the animal soul, into fuel to fuel avas Hashem. Then obviously, then you are transforming it. So
very good, very good, very good. Thank you for fielding the question. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's not directly relevant to our conversation here per se, but fine, which is fine. The point, I just will sum up because I see we should stop here. Bottom line is, like he says, I'll read one more line. V'nimtza the b'chinas Nekudah of Malchus, ime yeseh b'chinas v'keli eina b'chinas hashpah. So he's concluding the whole paragraph that he began at the bottom of page 1358. So though Malchus has a and a keli, like all spheres, but it's not in the form of hashpah at all, on its own. Malchus is not in hashpah, it's in a state of Kabbalah, state of receiving, absorbing, elevating, being encompassed. Now, as I said, once we finish the topic, it'll be clear why the Rebbe Rashab is elaborating. When we learned it the first time, we learned it more as line by line. Now, as we learn it in context of the bigger picture, we're going to see how this is vital in understanding how we climb and elevate how Malchus develops from where it is initially to becoming a full force in our lives and in the whole picture of Seder Ishtalshlus. But we'll get there. So I'm going to stop here before the parentheses on and I didn't finish the paragraph on page 1360. And there's a few more pages where he continues till page 1364 about this Makabel Malchus. I know it's a little dense, and I hope everybody has the patience. We'll make it through. And again, as I said, I'll try to put it into the broader context of what we're learning about Torah and the Ner Mitzvah and the concept of Makabel and Mashpia. So it's a little, we have to plot along here and make it through, as we will do that, and please God. Okay. I know I've been traveling sporadically. Tomorrow I'm going to Cleveland. I think there will be a class because my flight is a little later. But Wednesday I won't be back for the class. So tomorrow most likely, yes. I'll post if there's any change. And Wednesday not, but then Thursday back on. And then I'm here for, indefinitely for a while. Just to give you a sense of what's happening. Okay. So I'm sorry for these breaks, these intermittent breaks. So let's stop here.